Professor Nam Yong Lee's long-form commentary, Preparing Our People's Asset Protection Strategy Against a Second IMF Crisis, a flight from the one, numbers that reveal the fear of a second IMF-style crisis. Hello, this is Lee Nam Yong TV. At this very moment, the Korean people are quietly but decisively casting a massive vote with their bank accounts. As of 2024, Korean individual investors held approximately $112.1 billion worth of American stocks. $112.1 billion worth of American stocks, an increase of more than 60% in just 1 year. Over the same period, they recorded net sales of more than 5 trillion won in domestic equities, and the Kospi index fell by roughly 10% in a single year. In numerical terms, Korea is becoming a country that sells Korean stocks and buys American stocks. The foreign currency deposit data are equally striking. As of the end of August 2025, residents' foreign currency deposits stood at around $107.6 billion, and even in October, the balance remained at about $101.8 billion. The overwhelming majority of this is in US dollars. In practice, our citizens are treating dollar deposits as a second national currency, in place of deposits in Korean won. Meanwhile, Korea's net external assets, that is, the amount we have lent to the rest of the world, minus what we have borrowed, reached roughly $1.1 trillion at the end of 2024, about 40 to 50% of GDP, placing us among the world's top 10 net creditor nations. On paper alone, Korea is already a country that lends money to the world. Yet individual Korean citizens do not trust their own currency or financial system and are fleeing into dollars and American financial assets. This is the collective subconscious fear of a second IMF-style bailout, and it is the economic front line of our ongoing systemic struggle. The deposit insurance system, our first line of defense in a second IMF crisis. Let me now turn to the question that many people are most curious about. People often ask, they say that if a bank fails, deposits are protected up to 50 million won and now up to 100 million won, but what is this system really for? And why does the post office claim to provide unlimited protection? The deposit insurance system is not a blank check under which the government guarantees every last one of every citizen's money. It is a social safety device through which the state promises, in times of financial crisis and bank runs, at least up to this amount is safe, so do not panic and withdraw everything at once. Here we must make one very important point crystal clear. For commercial banks, savings banks, insurance companies, and certain securities cash balances covered by deposit protection, the system does not distinguish between deposits in Korean won and deposits in US dollars. Whether in won or dollars, all eligible deposits, savings accounts, certain trusts, and some client funds within the same financial institution are added together, and up to 100 million won per person per institution is protected. In other words, if you hold 70 million won and the equivalent of 50 million won in US dollars at the same bank, only 100 million won of the combined 120 million won is protected, and the remaining 20 million won falls outside coverage. The criterion is not the type of currency, but the total amount per financial institution. Looking at global standards, most advanced economies adopt a partial coverage model. In the United States, the FDIC protects up to $250,000 per depositor per bank, which is roughly 300 million won. In the European Union, the guarantee is €100,000 per depositor per bank, or around 140 million won. The United Kingdom has decided to raise its limit from £85,000 to £120,000, lifting the protection ceiling to the equivalent of roughly the mid-200 million won range. Japan insures up to 10 million yen, or around 80 to 90 million won. Korea, by contrast, temporarily adopted a full guarantee during the 1997 IMF foreign exchange crisis, then reverted in 2001 to partial coverage with a 50 million won cap. That cap remained unchanged for 24 years until it was finally doubled to 100 million won as of the 1st of September 2025. In purely numerical terms, this is around 1/3 of the US level and about 70% of the European standard. In other words, the savings of Korean citizens have been relatively less protected than those of citizens in other advanced economies. The increase to 100 million won is certainly progress, but it is still difficult to call the level generous. The deposit insurance ceiling represents both the maximum burden the state can realistically shoulder through insurance funds and tax revenues, and a safety belt that restrains reckless behavior by banks and depositors. If a second IMF-style crisis comes, we must examine with cold objectivity and hard numbers whether this safety belt will truly function and whether the limit is sufficient. The 100 million won limit at banks versus the Postal Service's unlimited guarantee, different structures, different political meanings. Why then are deposits at commercial banks, savings banks, insurers and securities firms protected only up to 100 million won, while postal savings are popularly described as being guaranteed without limit? The key lies in the fact that their legal structures are entirely different. Deposits in ordinary financial institutions are covered by the Depositor Protection Act. These institutions pay insurance premiums to the Korea Deposit Insurance Corporation, which uses the accumulated fund to reimburse depositors up to 100 million won per person per institution if that institution fails. Private financial firms, the Deposit Insurance Fund, and ultimately the state share the burden in 3 layers. Postal savings, however, are not covered by the Depositor Protection Act. Under a separate statute governing postal savings and insurance, the law stipulates that the state bears responsibility for the payment of postal savings and insurance benefits, meaning that it is not the Deposit Insurance Fund, but the central government itself that bears full principal and interest liability. Here as well, there is no distinction between deposits in Korean won and deposits in US dollars. For all deposits and insurance products handled by the postal financial system, the state assumes full payment responsibility regardless of the currency in which they are denominated. Put simply, ordinary banks protect up to 100 million won per person, per institution, by aggregating balances in won and in dollars, while the postal financial system provides a full sovereign guarantee on all eligible deposits and insurance products it handles, can in won or in foreign currency. There is a crucial misunderstanding that citizens must avoid. The full guarantee on postal savings is not a golden goose product that the state freely grants to the wealthy alone. It is a piece of public infrastructure and a safety net for ordinary citizens, created to secure basic financial access in rural areas and regions underserved by commercial banks through a nationwide network of roughly 2,000 post offices. If postal savings balances expand excessively, the cost must eventually be borne through increased issuance of government bonds, higher taxes, and painful fiscal austerity. The creditworthiness of postal savings is ultimately tied to Korea's sovereign credit rating, its public debt to GDP ratio, and its government bond yields. If the debt ratio surges from 40% of GDP to 60 or 70%, and bond yields climb from 2% to 4 or 5%, then unlimited protection at the post office risks becoming a phrase on paper that is not fully backed by fiscal capacity. US dollar cash and American stocks, not a shield against a second IMF crisis, but a different kind of risk. On the streets and online, one often hears comments such as, "Since the bank only protects up to 100 million won, I would rather hold my money in cash dollars," or "The won is finished. The only answer is to invest long-term in US stocks." In fact, as of the end of 2024, Korean investors held approximately $112.1 billion in American equities, an increase of more than 60% in a single year. Over the same period, domestic equities saw net sales amounting to several trillion won, and the Kospi index fell by roughly 10%. Some analyses suggest that in 2025 alone, around $30 billion of fresh funds flowed into US stocks. In numerical terms, the dependence of Korean individual investors on the US market is already approaching a dangerous threshold. Foreign currency deposits tell a similar story. In August 2025, foreign currency deposits held by residents stood at around $107.6 billion, and by October, they still amounted to roughly $101.8 billion, with US dollar deposits accounting for close to 90% of the total. On top of this, there are statistics indicating that dollar-linked stablecoin transactions alone reached roughly 57 trillion won in the first quarter of 2025. If one adds together dollar deposits, dollar-denominated bonds, and dollar stablecoins, the exposure of Korean households and firms to dollar assets already totals several hundred trillion won. The numbers tell us clearly that we are already deeply embedded inside a de facto dollar economy. The real issue is that simply holding more US dollar cash or American stocks does not make risk disappear. It merely transforms that risk into new forms, such as foreign exchange risk, stock market volatility, and exposure to US political and monetary policy. According to research by international organizations and central banks, countries whose deposits, loans, and assets are heavily dollarized tend to experience greater financial instability in response to even minor exchange rate movements, and their own monetary policy becomes less effective. If a second IMF-style crisis occurs, countries with a high proportion of dollar assets are more vulnerable to violent currency depreciation, shortages of foreign currency liquidity, and capital flight. Rational decision-making is therefore not about how much dollar exposure you have, but about how well you balance dollars and won, and domestic and foreign assets within a coherent and disciplined portfolio. A relational philosophy perspective on the vast network connecting money, the state, citizens, and global markets. Relational philosophy does not view the world as a collection of isolated objects, but rather as a web of interdependent relationships. From this perspective, the Korean won, the US dollar, commercial bank deposits, postal savings, and American equities are not simply separate products. They are different nodes within a single network that links money, the state, citizens, and global markets. First, the won is a currency that is married to the Korean system itself. The value of the won depends not only on the Bank of Korea's policy interest rate, but also on a host of other numerical indicators, such as the national debt ratio, the size of the current account surplus, the credibility of the courts, the intensity of political conflict, the pace of aging and the birth rate, GDP growth and unemployment. As these numbers deteriorate, the share of the won in citizens' wallets declines and the share of the dollar rises. Second, the deposit insurance system and postal savings constitute the minimum safe zone that the state offers its citizens. The size of the deposit insurance fund, the balance of postal savings, the public debt ratio, and the level of government bond yields jointly determine the thickness of this safe zone. In a second IMF-style crisis, the promise of protection has real meaning only within the limits that these figures can sustain. If the public debt to GDP ratio exceeds 60 to 70% and government bond yields surge above 5%, the fiscal cost of maintaining full postal guarantees and a 100 million won deposit insurance limit increases exponentially. Behind the simple phrase, the state guarantees unlimited protection, lies the difficult question, how much more will citizens have to pay in taxes and what social programs will have to be reduced to make this promise credible? Third, the US dollar and American assets are channels that bring both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of the US system into our own. US public debt has already surpassed $30 trillion, and the country faces high interest rates, political polarization, and an intensifying strategic rivalry with China. Yet, because the dollar is the world's key reserve currency, capital from around the globe continues to flow into US markets, and Korea is deeply riding that tide. The crucial question is not, should we trust the United States or not, but to what extent and in what proportion should we tie ourselves to the United States? A healthy system manages the balance between its own currency and the dollar, and between domestic and foreign assets, through clear numerical targets and limits. Nationalism without numbers is dangerous, but blind love of the dollar without numerical discipline is equally dangerous. Rebuilding the national financial safety net through the lens of the U.S. Federal Enterprise Architecture, FEA. Let us now reconsider Korea's financial safety net from the perspective of the U.S. Federal Enterprise Architecture, FEA. The U.S. federal government decomposes its fiscal, tax, social security, and financial stability functions into business areas, business functions, and service components, and manages performance indicators and risk metrics at each layer. The Republic of Korea must likewise treat its financial safety net as a single, integrated national architecture and decide in advance what do we protect, up to what amount, and what must each individual be responsible for. To avert a second IMF-style crisis, we must pay attention to both structure and numbers. Our current system is a patchwork of stopgaps and populist measures. For 24 years, the deposit insurance limit for bank, savings bank, insurance, and some securities deposits was frozen at 50 million won and was only belatedly raised to 100 million won. Postal savings, justified historically by their public finance role, still enjoy a full sovereign guarantee. At the same time, cross-border securities investment, foreign currency deposits, and dollar stablecoins are effectively unconstrained in volume, while education and warning mechanisms regarding currency risk and systemic risk have lagged behind. In the language of FEA, this is a case where some functions have been optimized in isolation, while the overall architecture remains unbalanced. In most advanced economies, the financial safety net is designed in 3 layers. The first layer covers salary accounts, everyday living expenses, and emergency funds. This is the deposit protection zone, a minimum dignity layer jointly backed by deposit insurance and the state. The second layer consists of pensions, insurance, domestic bonds, and blue-chip equities. This is the medium-risk asset formation layer that protects long-term retirement security and the middle class. The third layer comprises US stocks, overseas bonds, and alternative investments. Here, individual responsibility and choice dominate, and public guarantees are minimal. For each layer, governments should set different levels of protection, tax incentives, disclosure requirements, and regulatory intensity, and manage these quantitatively. Only then can the system achieve both stability and growth. Korea must urgently reform the Depositor Protection Act, the Postal Savings and Insurance Laws, the Public Pension Laws, the Capital Markets Act, and foreign exchange regulations as a coherent national financial architecture at the level of the U.S. Federal Enterprise Architecture. The national blueprint for preventing a second IMF-style crisis must emerge from this comprehensive redesign. 3 practical asset protection strategies we can implement now to prepare for a second IMF crisis. Finally, I would like to summarize 3 realistic, number-based asset protection strategies that our citizens can begin implementing immediately. First, make full use of the basic safety net provided by deposit insurance. The protection limit is now 100 million won per person, per financial institution, regardless of whether the deposits are in Korean won or in US dollars. If your household has 300 million won in deposits, it is rational and prudent to spread those funds across at least 3 different financial institutions. If you have 1 billion won, using at least 10 institutions is reasonable. You must always remember that if you hold both won deposits and dollar deposits at the same bank, the coverage applies to the combined total, up to 100 million won. Survival in a second IMF-style crisis will not favor those who merely believe that banks will never fail, but rather those who understand the numbers and the institutional rules and act accordingly. The people who survived the first IMF crisis were not guided by vague intuition alone, but by knowledge of figures and systems. Second, use postal savings as the ultimate safety anchor, but do not overestimate them. The postal financial system also provides protection without distinguishing between $1 and dollars. For all deposits and insurance products it handles, the state assumes full payment responsibility regardless of currency. It is entirely reasonable to keep 3 to 6 months of living expenses and part of your emergency liquidity in postal savings. However, once 70 or 80% of your total financial assets are concentrated in a single institution such as the post office, a safety net intended for everyone becomes a private refuge for a few. You must continually monitor indicators such as the national debt ratio and government bond yields and ask yourself, is full postal protection fiscally sustainable for the next 10 or 20 years? In a second IMF-style crisis, the first promise to be tested will be the state's pledge of full sovereign guarantee. Third, treat the US dollar and American stocks not as escape hatches from a collapsing Korean system, but as components of a globally diversified portfolio. Allocating 20 to 30% of your financial assets to dollars and overseas equities can be a reasonable form of diversification. However, when 70 to 80% of your wealth is placed entirely in US stocks and dollars, you are effectively severing your own ties to the won, to Korean enterprises, and to jobs in the domestic economy. Korea is already a net creditor nation, with net external assets exceeding $1 trillion, and the National Pension Fund alone manages assets of more than 1,300 trillion won. If a country of this scale cannot trust its own currency and domestic capital market, its system will decay from within. The way to prevent a second IMF-style crisis is not to convert all wealth into dollars, but to allocate dollars and won and domestic and foreign assets in a balanced and numerically disciplined manner. The front line of our systemic struggle is not the shouting in the National Assembly or the rallies in public squares. It lies in the passbooks and household ledgers of every home in this country, when each citizen understands clearly, in concrete numerical terms, what the deposit insurance limit and the full guarantee of postal savings actually mean, and how a certain amount, or in some cases the entirety of their deposits, is protected regardless of whether it is in won or in dollars, and when they allocate their assets among won, postal savings, dollars, and overseas investments in a balanced way, then Korea's liberal democratic system and financial safety net will gain the resilience needed to withstand even a second IMF-style crisis. Thank you for watching this long-form commentary by Professor Nam Yong Lee.